So I'm going to talk a little bit about threats to the infrastructure, because internet security or cyber security, which is sort of the sales word for it, is a very, very broad spectrum. But being as this is a DNS or a domain name system forum, I'm going to talk about some of the threats that involve DNS. So I'm going to start with talking a little bit about the mission of the organization I work for. So we've talked about ICANN a little bit. Let's see if I get a little red dot, a little green dot. Doesn't work. So I don't know if you can read this, but core to our values and our commitments is to focus on the security and the stability of the identifier systems. That means things like domain names, IP addresses, and the way they're used. So that's why ICANN has a group, which I lead, that look solely at security issues that are, and other issues that are affecting those systems. So why would you attack or abuse the domain name system? Well, why do you use a domain name? Right? It depends who you are. You know, if you're a businessman, or and engineers like me, we just say it's a way of mapping names to numbers and putting in a layer of indirection so that we can change those numbers without telling the guys who are actually getting to the websites or whatever service it is. Business people are using it to make business. I think that Sherman here just talked a little bit about the money that is made on the internet and how much industry happens on there. Governments use it to provide you with services. You know, your local law enforcement may have a website. You may vote online. You may do your taxes online. Bad guys use the internet too, so they think of it as a way to misuse or exploit people. So they can actually misuse the DNS or exploit it or interrupt it so that they can make money. It's all about the money in the end. So I went straight past that. So you have to remember that pretty much everything on the internet in some way, shape or form uses the domain name system. Obviously websites, but of course emails have domain names in them, FTP sites. If you're doing voice over IP and you're using a protocol called SIP, then you're using domain names. Even when you point on one of those clicky things on your phone, if you're pushing buttons on apps, in the background, it's probably using the domain name system. So it really is very critical to everything we do on the internet. So let's look at some of the ways that people can actually attack that. And I cut these slides down because I've got about 100 different ways people can abuse the internet, but I'll try and pull out some pertinent ones. So this is something we call exploit to fail, a denial of service attack. And these are real attacks, by the way. Hopefully you've all patched all your software. This one's a fairly old one. But there was a time when by sending a specific DNS query to our server, you could make the server reboot. All right, so if you're relying on that name server to get your internet connectivity and the bad guy keeps making it reboot, that's probably annoying. That was fixed. There's a patch. This was in bind, but it was a real case, and we come across these kind of things on occasion. There's a very similar attack vector that allows you to own the name server. We call this exploit to own. So sending a malformed query to a name server allowed you to actually do a buffer overflow and thereby get into the system and take control of it. That's probably not good. Once again, it was a real situation. Somebody asked earlier about DDoS or distributed denial of service. So DDoS start with, are basically any kind of attack that's trying to saturate your services so the system won't work. So the way the DNS works, the domain name system works, is that you send a question, you get an answer. So a very basic element of attack is to do what we call a reflection attack. I send this gentleman over here who's not listening a question, but I pretend I'm this gentleman over here. So when I say, hey, what time is it? Or hey, what's the IP address for this? Instead of answering me, he answers this gentleman, right? Doesn't seem much harm in that, does there? Of course, I can ask a very short question which will return a very large answer. So I can say, you know, tell me all the days of the week, or, you know, and a lot come back. So I can ask for a very short question, get a lot of information back, and we can do that in the DNS. Obviously not days of the week, it's not a calendar, but I'm just using that as an example. So that's an amplified response. I ask him a short question, he sends him a large answer. Now imagine that there's, well, this is a horrible idea, but imagine there's 10 million of me, right? And we all ask this guy a very short, ask this guy a question, and he sends them all back to this gentleman, or I ask many of you the same question and you all send them back to this gentleman. Sorry to pick on you. Then obviously this is getting worse. He's now getting a lot of traffic sent to this system, and I've just been DOSed myself, okay? So, and of course I can combine that with large packets. The reason we can do that is because the protocol is something we call UDP. It's basically a fire and forget kind of question, but of course TCP, which is the main protocol that's used on the internet for other things, allows you to actually acknowledge the communication. So I could send a question to him saying, I'm going to do a TCP transaction, but I'm him, and he can send the acknowledgement, that what we call the SYNAC, to this gentleman. It's another way of depleting all of its resources. He doesn't care that it's not actually going to work. He's not trying to build connections between these two. He's just trying to stop his service from working. We've seen these in real world, you know, these are real world situations. Configuration poisoning. Now, technically this isn't attacking the DNS, it's abusing the way the system works. So if I've got a piece of malware on your network, say on your laptop, who has ever had malware? Oh, none of you admitting it. I've been infected by malware before. It happens. The difference is I know it, and you lot haven't figured it out yet. So DNS Changer was a specific piece of malware, and what it did is it changed the name servers you use. So when I think I'm asking my ISP to tell me where google.com is, I'm actually asking a piece of criminal infrastructure where google.com is, and they can send me where they want. This was interesting because when taking down this malware, we had a dilemma. We had hundreds of thousands, if not millions of machines that thought this criminal infrastructure was their name servers. And when disrupting this criminal ecosystem, we actually had to put different name servers in the place that were, if you like, clean and given the proper answers. So it's not always easy to clear these kind of things up, but once again, a real life scenario. If you look up DNS Changer, you will find it hit the news. That happens more and more these days. So they're not actually attacking the DNS itself, they're just changing your configurations. Man-in-the-middle attacks. You know, if they can get between you and your name server, they can often give you different answers. There's a particular kind of man-in-the-middle attack that we call an evil twin attack. So who here has ever been into a coffee shop or a hotel and joined the Wi-Fi and not had to put any credentials in? Right? That's an open Wi-Fi. So if I put up a Wi-Fi access point with the same non-credentials, i.e. the same name, and you connect to it, a lot of the time you'll use those for your DNS. They'll give you your DNS server information, so I can just point you elsewhere. Unfortunately, it's still very common for access points not to have any form of credentials, and that means it's very easy to do this. And as a end user, you'll probably never notice, because what a lot of them do, for example, when they are spoofing your bank, okay, you can buy software packages with all the websites of all the local bank sites, and you will go to your bank, and it will look like your bank. They will take your credentials, and then they will forward you to the bank and log you in. So there's a delay, but you're probably not even going to notice that you went to a different website. It's not a good idea if people have your bank credentials in general. Once again, these are real-life scenarios. Well, that's sort of attacking the DNS, but what about the registration system of the DNS, right? The other part of the DNS is that you actually have to register these names, so we see exploits against that. And we also see exploits where they use the DNS for other things. Because most firewall packages and middleware boxes that are defending your network tend to allow DNS through pretty much openly. There's a lot of boxes out there that say port 53, which is DNS. If it's UDP, which is the most common protocol, pass it through, leave it open. I can bury data in DNS answers or queries, and sometimes I can just send other protocols through on that port. It doesn't have to be DNS. If the port's wide open, I can use port 53 for something else. So people exfiltrate data using the fact that the DNS is this ubiquitous service that people allow in and out of their networks. It used to be port 80 that they did a lot of this on, which is websites. These days they do a lot of it on port 53. Of course, if you are managing a botnet, everybody here, I hope, knows what a robotic network or a botnet is. It's basically not one infected machines, but thousands or millions of infected machines operated by one individual or group. Because everything's open and you can send pretty much anything you want in a DNS packet, they use the domain name system to send the controls, the commands and the controls, back to the infected machines. Feederbot and Morto are just two of many malware variants that do this. Domain name hijacking. Right? If you've got a name registered and it's important to you, say it's your business, then you have that information registered somewhere with a registrar. The registrar has a registry. These are all attack surfaces that bad guys will use. There was a case in this region which got a little bit of publicity, but not a lot, and the registry's been extremely open about it, where miscreants attacked the registration system to change the name servers, etc., for google.country code. And then whenever you went to google.country code, you weren't actually going to Google's machine, you were going to a different one. So they'd altered the DNS. Now when you went to that site, it said, hey, we have hacked Google's server. But in fact, they hadn't touched Google's server, they just redirected the DNS to go somewhere else. This happens more often than we'd like. I actually dealt with a case yesterday where a registry had been hit. And they're pretty good at getting back and fixing this stuff, but it's a target. Sometimes it's an easier target than these large multinational organizations that have hundreds of security staff, they're a much harder target to hit. And bad guys always go for the weakest targets. So they also go look at the registrars. They will also come for you. The beautiful thing about having a registered name is that you've also got a profile with your registrar, right? You're going to have a login and a password. And the best place to get that is probably just to ask you for it. So anybody here ever had somebody attempt to phish them? Right? So these are real emails. Because of the projector having low resolution, you can't read them, which is probably good. So these are emails that were sent out by bad people pretending to be registrars and saying, please go click on this link and log in. And just like the bank redirection, this is a registrar redirection. And once they have your name and password, they can do all kinds of havoc. Some things that you will notice, some things you won't. Obviously, if they steal the name and move it somewhere else, hopefully you will notice. But if they just do slight changes in the DNS information, you may not notice for days. So, this happens all the time. And, think about the data breaches we've had recently. Anybody affected by the Equifax breach? Pretty much everybody in America was. I live in California. I was affected. Never use the same name and password in two places. So I'm not too worried because they can have that password from Equifax because I don't use it anywhere else. Most people do. So if you use your registration credentials with other services, I'd recommend thinking about your password hygiene. So let's talk a little bit about some evolution of the way things get attacked and things we have or maybe haven't learned. So the threat landscape is evolving. The volumetric attacks or the denial of service attacks are getting larger and they're getting more frequent. Has anybody here ever been DDoSed? Oh, for once I'm not the only one. Great. Has anybody ever wanted to DDoS somebody? Okay, that's better. You can buy DDoS services online. They're cheap. There are organizations that sell this as a service. This is criminality or at least badness on the internet commercialized. So, this is evolving. There were some attacks that were very well documented. There was an attack called the Dyn attack, where a large DNS provider was attacked and caused all kinds of chaos for various customers. So it's not getting better. And booters or stressors, as we call them, those are those services that you can go and buy. Fortunately, they do get a lot of attention from law enforcement these days. I love it when these people go to jail. Botnets are getting more complex, and they're getting smarter, the people who are writing them. I'll talk a little bit about a couple of botnets next. The Internet of Threats, I mean things, is becoming problematic, and I'll come to that in a moment. Has everybody heard of Mirai? Mirai is a malware variant that attacked, a lot of the attack surface was video servers. You can buy these in large retail stores. I had one at my house. I had disconnected it a year before because I actually look at my devices. I'm a big fan of looking at IoT devices and then throwing them in the trash. I've got hundreds of them. So I had one of these devices and I actually reported the issue, as had many other issues, many other people. But it was a cheap device put on the internet, and there were because they were in the major retail stores, there were thousands of these out there. Not good. So, anybody heard of Avalanche? So Avalanche was a, not a botnet, but a series of malware with botnets. So it wasn't one variant, it was multiple, but Avalanche is the name that law enforcement used for the generic grouping of malware variants. It's really interesting. So using malware to deliver new compromises, you could buy pieces of the Avalanche network if you wanted to do DDoS or spam campaigns or phish campaigns. It was used for moving black money around, criminal funds. It's very interesting. A lot of financial fraud attacks. It was basically almost a cloud-like experience, one of these services where you just go and buy the piece you want for criminal infrastructure. So they are advancing. So these are the 20 variants you could actually get. I don't know if you can read that. There's Gosnims in there and Rovniks and a few other smaller malware variants, but you could buy them. You could go onto their user interface on the dark web, where none of you are ever going to go, right? You remember that piece. And you could actually go on there and you could choose which infection base you wanted. You could choose which services you wanted. And it wasn't expensive. So, did I get my slides? Not really. I think half my slides missing there. So it took a long while to dismantle Avalanche, years. So am I missing part of my slide? It's blank up here, but shouldn't be up there. Never mind. Oh, Adobe Connect changed it. Lovely. Never mind. So basically, if you're deploying malware, I mean, obviously it takes you a little while if you're going to write your own. A lot of people don't write their own malware, they just go buy it. Like I said, it's a business. Actually deploying that malware is a matter of hours, right? Because there's a massive, you can buy infection bases, you can infect via known infection channels. It's not hard to build a botnet. Starting your campaign, be that a phish campaign or some other form of criminal activity, is also very fast. Hours. Now, the people dealing with malware, like the antivirus, etc., will start getting reports fairly quickly. So it'll be known probably in days. It will be reversed engineered within days. And then a few days later, maybe people will be coming to law enforcement and saying, hey, somebody stole my money, somebody stole my bank account. And then the investigation starts. And then all the paperwork starts. And before you know it, you are months ahead. And I'll talk a little bit about, well, maybe I won't. It's going to get me slides. I'll talk a little bit about some of the effort involved in taking down this kind of infrastructure. And remember, a lot of this infrastructure is also used for those DDoS attacks as well. So this infrastructure is actually a threat to the ecosystem as well as individuals. You know, Mirai was used, I believe, as part of the Dyn attack. That took down lots of websites, lots of DNS. The websites were still there. How we doing, Daniel? We having fun? You should have got a PC. Well, I did tell him when I gave him the slides that I had a copy of WannaCry on the thing, but he didn't believe me. Yeah, never accept USB sticks from people you don't know, or people you do know if they're people like me. Let's see what we got here. All right, so that's the same thing. So it's like I was saying, it takes a long time. And you know, here I say months later, but in the case of Avalanche, it was actually years later. And we're still not finished. Because once you start disrupting this infrastructure, you still got to think about how are we going to clean up the end systems, how are the bad guys going to evolve, because you're constantly chasing them. Is it still working? What have you done then? There you go. So Avalanche supported something we call domain generation algorithms. These are the names that are used for the command and control, sort of a call home for the malware. And they use them across, I think it was something like 64 or 60 top-level domains. The takedown or the disruption of the system required that law enforcement interacted with all of the registries for these names. You can't just take down half of it, you have to try and take down all of it. On the left here, you can see from Tiny Banker what domains look like. Those are names that the bad guys are planning at some point possibly to register so that they can do command and control. The beauty of this from their side is that every day they only need to register one name out of the thousands that are possible. And as the good guys, to block them, you actually need to block every single one because you don't know which one they're going to try and register. It's a very unbalanced game. So Avalanche used something called fast flux, which is basically the ability to change the name or the IP address of the system, the DNS information, very quickly. This is information you can get from Europol, and I just put it up to demonstrate that it's actually quite complex. They had DGAs that were quite complex. They were using multiple variants of malware. They were doing fast flux. They had their own criminal infrastructure, like physical machines. It's complex. So Avalanche, there were 5 arrests in 4 countries. That meant doors going down, police officers actually going into premises and arresting people across multiple countries. There were 37 searches in 7 countries. Machines, physical machines seized in 13 countries. We had to block, so not take away, but actually stop people registering more than 830,000 domain names. And then all the awareness raising and the victim remediation or the cleaning up that's still going on today. So dealing with this kind of problem in the domain name space, because there's a lot of domain name elements here, is problematic. I'm aware I'm on time here. So Mirai is a really good lesson in not learning. The communication techniques that the servers used were unencrypted. This is something that we stopped doing in the early 90s. Does anybody here use Telnet? Oh no! SSH, people. Encryption, get rid of Telnet. Technologies that most of us stopped using 10, 15, sometimes 20 years ago are still being deployed in new equipment. What's wrong with that? Well, it's cheap, that's why they do it. This should just never have happened. Yeah. I'm not going to go into the details of Mirai because I know I'm running out, but basically, you know, the other thing that they did is they did sort of the admin thing, user admin, password admin, like lots of boxes that you buy, not just the ones that are in Mirai, have default passwords. That's not a good idea. You know, there are mechanisms and techniques for doing unique passwords with boxes these days. You know, even if they printed on the box, it's still better than having admin. So these are lessons we haven't learned. It's mainly IoT devices, Mirai, and there are thousands of them out there. It's kind of depressing as a security guy and somebody who looks at IoT to see just what is out there. This brings DDoS possibility to a whole new level. I mean, if you think about the amount of devices, I mean, why did they pick on video devices? Video has vast throughput. These are machines that are designed to send large packets, and the security on them was just terrible. Oops, another slide that's not really there. So WannaCry was another piece of malware that was actually patched in the operating system. It affected Microsoft operating systems, and it was actually patched, and the patch was released weeks and weeks before the attack. So if people were actually patching their systems, it wouldn't have worked. So we've learned that people have still not learned to keep their systems up to date. There's a reason why software providers send out security updates. You should probably do them. WannaCry would just never have happened. So what have we learned? Attacks are increasing. They're getting more elaborate. What have we yet to learn? Developers just ignore history. It's like every generation forgets the things that their parents learned, right? This is the same in real life too, right? People who have children, and you see the mistakes your children make, and you think, well, we learned that 20, 30 years ago. It's the same thing in hardware and software development. They've just not learned the lessons. Yeah, and I don't know an answer to that. It's probably something we're just going to have to deal with. It's part of human nature. So, if you could take one lesson home, how many of you here use the DNS? You all do. You meant to all put your hand up when I asked that question. How many of you actually run DNS infrastructure or run networks? Right, so the one lesson here, it's not fire and forget. You don't install Bind or NSD or whichever software you are on a box and then walk away. Right? Your DNS is critical to your business. So if you're the guy responsible for the DNS in your business, or you know the guy, make sure that you're keeping it up to date. Make sure that you're being vigilant about how it can be misused. We're going to pass these slides out. There's a whole bunch of reading material on attack surface and the various things you can do to protect your network. And I'm then going to hand over the microphone. And I think we're going to take questions at the end, all right?